The red pen was still uncapped in my hand when the water hit my face. Not water. Champagne. Someone's champagne, flung across the boardroom table hard enough to catch the corner of my mouth, and for one full second the 22 people who worked 2 floors below me went silent to watch it happen. You don't interrupt a partner presentation with a hunch, Quinn. Holloway said my name like it tasted bad. Get your things. My things were a laminate badge, a coffee mug shaped like a lighthouse, and 11 pages of manifest numbers I had spent 3 nights matching by hand because the automated audit software had flagged nothing, and my gut had flagged everything. I had circled 41 line items in red ink, 41 shipments that weighed more leaving the Castellan Holdings dock than they weighed arriving at port, over 11 months, always on the same route, always signed off by the same director. Nobody in that room wanted to hear it. I was 26 years old, an unregistered omega on suppressants I could barely afford, 6 months behind on my mother's care facility invoice, and I had just been fired in front of a boardroom for being right about something no one asked me to be right about. I picked my pen up off the carpet. My hands were shaking. My father used to say a red pen was the only honest tool in accounting because it never let a number lie twice. I put it in my coat pocket next to his watch, the one that stopped the day he died, the one I have never once had repaired, and I walked out with what was left of my dignity held together by nothing but momentum. I want to say I saw it coming. I didn't. Before I tell you what happened next, one small thing, and then I promise we go straight back into it. If you want more nights like the one I'm about to give you, do one thing for me right now. Subscribe to the channel so the next story finds you. The elevator down from the 31st floor stopped on 19. It wasn't supposed to stop on 19. 19 was executive security, a floor so restricted that half the building didn't know it existed, and the doors opened on a woman I had seen exactly twice before, always from a distance, always flanked by people who moved like her silence was a weather system. Sable Castellan. The Iron Heiress of Castellan Holdings, the papers called her, the woman who had taken a shipping company on the edge of bankruptcy and turned it into the largest logistics empire on the eastern seaboard by the time she was 31. She smelled like wet slate after rain, and underneath it, clove smoke, and both of those things reached me before she said a single word. You're the one who found the weight discrepancies. Not a question. I got fired for it about 4 minutes ago. My voice came out steadier than I felt, which happens to me under enough pressure. Everything narrows down to numbers and breath. I know. I watched the feed. She looked at the folder still clutched against my chest like it might be confiscated too. Give it to me. I didn't hand her the folder because she asked. I handed it to her because I recognized, in the particular quiet way she went still while reading page 4, the exact look I get when a column finally balances. She read all 11 pages standing in a hallway with a fired employee dripping champagne onto the marble, and when she looked up, something in her face had rearranged itself. 41 shipments, all the same signature. Desmond Castellan, I said. I checked twice before Holloway saw the name and threw me out. Her jaw did something small and controlled. My cousin. I should have apologized. I didn't get the chance. She turned and started walking, and because I had nothing left to lose that day, no job, no severance, a mother's bill sitting unpaid in my bag like a stone, I followed her into an office with a view of the harbor, and my whole understanding of my life changed inside of 9 minutes. I need a wife, Sable Castellan said, standing at her window with her back to me. In 31 days, My mother's trust requires the acting head of Castellan Holdings to be bonded by their 35th birthday, or the controlling shares transfer to the next living blood relative. That relative is my cousin, the same man who signed 41 falsified manifests. I laughed. It was not a polite laugh. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a contract. She turned around. Her eyes were the gray of a storm that hasn't decided yet whether it's going to break. Marriage in name. A salary that clears whatever debt put those circles under your eyes. Full access to Castellan financial records so you can find out exactly how deep my cousin's hand is in my company, quietly, before he finds out you're looking. In exchange, you live in my residence, you attend what functions I require, and you let the world believe I have found someone. That's insane. That's Tuesday, she said, and something in her mouth almost smiled. I thought about my mother's room at Brightwater, the invoice with the red overdue stamp that looked exactly like my own ink. I thought about being right and being punished for it in the same breath. I thought about the watch in my pocket, stopped at 17 minutes past 4, the last honest hour of my father's life. I want it in writing, I said, every clause. I wouldn't respect you if you didn't. Sable Castellan crossed the room and held out a pen that was not red, and I took it anyway. And somewhere on the 19th floor of a tower I had never been allowed to enter, I signed my name next to a stranger's and became, on paper, a married woman. The contract had 11 pages, same as my report. I noticed that and said nothing. She had a car waiting before the ink dried. Not a company car, hers, black, quiet as a held breath. And when the driver held the door, I understood for the first time in my life what it felt like to be expected somewhere instead of tolerated. You'll want to know the rules, she said once we were moving. I assumed there'd be a document for that too. There is. Rule 1 is not in it. She was looking out the window, not at me, and her voice dropped into something almost careful. Nothing happens between us that you have not asked for first. Not a hand on your back at a dinner, not a scent mark on a coat sleeve so my cousin's people believe the story. You tell me the line. I will not cross it without your word. I hadn't expected that. I had expected command, the alpha reputation, the ice the papers loved to print. What I got instead was a woman handing me a door with the lock on my side. And if I ask you to cross it, I said, before I could stop myself. The look she gave me lasted exactly as long as a heartbeat and undid something in my chest that had been wound tight since the moment champagne hit my face. Then we'll discuss it, Sable said. Slowly, the Castellan residence took up the top 4 floors of a building on Harrow Street, and the first thing I noticed, stepping off a private elevator into a foyer with ceilings I couldn't have reached with both arms and a ladder, was that it smelled like nobody actually lived there. Marble. Cut flowers replaced before they could wilt. No trace of a person, only the architecture of one. Miss, Odell will show you the East Wing, Sable said, already shrugging out of her coat, already retreating into the posture of a woman running a company instead of a marriage. It's yours. Full stop. I don't enter without an invitation. Miss Odell turned out to be a small, sharp-eyed woman somewhere past 70 who looked me over once, the way you'd assess a plant to see if it had been watered, and made a small sound of approval. You're thinner than the last one, she said. There was a last one? There was a rumor of one. Never made it past the lobby. Miss, Odell picked up my single duffel bag like it weighed nothing and started walking. Ms. Castellan doesn't bring people home. You're the first. I filed that away the way I filed everything, quietly, in a column, to be added up later. The east wing had a bed the size of my old apartment, and a kitchen I was fairly sure had never boiled water. I sat on the edge of the mattress with my father's watch in my palm, and did what I always did when the numbers of my life stopped balancing. I made a list. Rent, gone. Mother's invoice, covered as of this morning by a salary transfer that had already appeared, unasked, in an account I hadn't given anyone the number to. Job, gone, but replaced by 11 pages of financial access and a mandate to chase the truth I'd been fired for chasing. I told myself it was a transaction. I told myself that for 3 days, right up until the evening I came downstairs at 11 at night, unable to sleep, and found Sable Castellan standing in her own kitchen in shirt sleeves, with the fridge door open, staring into it like it had personally wronged her. "You don't strike me as someone who cooks," I said. "I don't." She didn't look up. "Miss Odell told me you hadn't eaten since noon. She also told me you take your tea with ginger, not sugar, because sugar upsets your stomach when you're stressed." Finally, she glanced over, and there was something almost sheepish in it, an expression I doubted the boardroom had ever once seen. "I bought ginger. I don't actually know what to do with it." I stood in that enormous cold kitchen and felt something crack open in my chest that had been sealed since my father's funeral. "You listened," I said. "It came out smaller than I meant it to. I run a company on details other people think are beneath noticing." Sable set the ginger down on the counter like it was evidence in a trial. "I intend to run this the same way." That was the first night the residence smelled like something other than flowers. It smelled, faintly, like ginger tea and rain-cold stone, and I went to sleep without adding a single number to my list. The friction came fast after that, the way it always does when a fairy tale meets a family that never signed off on it. The first board dinner I attended as Sable Castellan's wife, I wore a dress Miss Odell had produced from somewhere, with a note that only said she picked the color herself, deep green. Nothing like the thrift store blazers I owned. I stood at Sable's side in a ballroom full of people who had spent decades deciding I didn't exist, and I watched every one of them recalculate. Every one except Desmond. He found me by the bar, tall and handsome in the practiced, oiled way of a man who has never once doubted a room would give him what he wanted. "So you're the accountant," he said, before I'd even set my glass down. Cute. Sable always did like her tools sharp and disposable. "I'm not a tool," I said. "No," he smiled, and it did not reach anything behind his eyes. "You're a liability with a signature on a marriage license. Careful what you sign your name to next. Miss Quinn, my cousin, has a talent for spending people until there's nothing left to spend." I found the coat check an hour later, with my pulse still loud in my ears and a folded note tucked into my clutch that I hadn't put there. 4 words, no signature. "I see everything, accountant." I didn't sleep that night either, but this time it had nothing to do with ginger. Sable found me the next morning at the harbor window, with the note still in my hand, and when she read it, her whole posture changed, a stillness that had teeth in it. "He's threatening you to get to me," she said. "That's new. That's a mistake." She looked at me then, and her voice dropped out of the boardroom register entirely. "Tell me if he approaches you again. Not the lawyers first. Me first." "Why?" I asked, and I meant it as a real question, not a rhetorical one. "You don't owe me protection. This is a contract." It stopped being only a contract the night I bought ginger I didn't know how to use. She said it plainly, the way she said everything, no flourish, and it landed harder for the lack of one. "I don't know what to call what this is yet. I know I don't like the idea of my cousin's ink anywhere near you." I believed her. That was the frightening part, not that she'd said it, but that some traitorous, starving part of me believed her completely. The truth about Sable Castellan came out on a Tuesday, the way most true things do, sideways and by accident. I'd asked Rue Ibarra, her chief of staff, a woman built like a closed door and twice as talkative, why Sable never touched champagne at company events. Rue looked at me for a long moment before she answered, like she was deciding whether I'd earned it. Her mother died at a company gala. 14 years ago, heart failure, the coroner said, but everyone in that boardroom knew her father had spent 6 months moving money he shouldn't have touched, and Imogen Castellan found out an hour before she collapsed. Rue's mouth tightened. Sable was 21. She watched it happen from across the room and couldn't reach her in time. Her father disappeared with what was left of the operating accounts 3 weeks later. Sable spent every year since building a company nobody could ever steal out from under her again. I understood then, the ice, not cruelty. Armor built over a wound that had never once been allowed to close. That night I told Sable what Rue had told me, not to confront her, only so she'd know I knew. And she didn't deny a word of it. She sat across from me at the kitchen island with 2 mugs of ginger tea she had, by now, learned to make correctly, and she said, "Control was the only thing my mother's death taught me I could count on. I built an empire out of never being caught unprepared again." Her eyes came up to mine, gray gone soft at the edges. "You've made me unprepared every day for 2 weeks, and I haven't hated it once." The stakes doubled 3 days later, when I found the second set of ledgers. They were buried in a shell subsidiary Desmond had registered under a dead employee's name, and once I saw the pattern I couldn't unsee it, nearly $4 million routed out of Castellan Holdings over 11 months, funneled through the same overweight shipments I'd been fired for flagging in the first place. I brought it straight to Sable's office at 9 at night, breathless, 40 pages deep into the kind of math that had once cost me a job. "If this is real," Sable said, reading it standing at her desk, her voice gone very quiet, "he isn't just stealing. He's building a case that I'm negligent. Incompetent, a trustee vote could remove me before the bonding deadline even arrives, and he inherits control by default. Then we finish the audit before he finishes his case." She looked up at me across the desk, and for the first time since the elevator on the 19th floor, I saw something in her face that wasn't armor at all. "We," she repeated, like the words surprised her on the way out. "We," I said, and meant it as more than a pronoun. The storm hit 2 nights later, the kind that knocks half a city's power out at once, and it happened to land the same night Desmond's private investigator tried the fire stairwell of the Harrow Street building. I heard the door before Sable did, a scrape at the service entrance that didn't belong, and by the time her security reached the stairwell, the intruder was gone. But not before he'd gotten close enough to photograph the guest room I'd never once slept in, close enough to prove, to anyone who cared to look, that the Castellan marriage kept separate beds. Sable found me afterward on the terrace in the rain, arms wrapped around myself, furious in a way that had nowhere to go. "He's building a fraud case with one hand and a scandal case with the other," I said. "Whichever one lands first, he wins. Not tonight, he doesn't." Sable stepped close enough that her scent, clove and wet stone, cut clean through the storm. "Tell me to stop and I will." I didn't tell her to stop. I told her to come closer, and when her mouth found mine, it wasn't the kind of kiss you plan, all rain and 11 days of pretending, and it ended with both of us breathing hard against the terrace glass, with the city lights swimming below. "That wasn't in the contract," I said. "No," Sable said, forehead against mine. "That was the first true thing either of us has signed. We didn't finish what the storm started, not that night." She pulled back first, hand cupping my jaw with a restraint that cost her something visible. "Ask me with your words when you're ready," she said. "Not the rain. not the fear. I went to bed alone that night and lay awake doing the only thing that ever calmed me, counting, not numbers this time. Every place her hand had been. The wound tending came slow, the way real trust always does, in kitchens and hallways instead of storms. I told her about my father on a Sunday, how he'd been an accountant too, how he'd taught me that a ledger never lies even when the people reading it do, how his heart had simply stopped one Tuesday afternoon at 17 minutes past 4 while he sat at his desk, and how I still carried his watch, frozen at that exact minute. Because fixing it felt like losing the last version of him that existed. Sable took the watch from my hand that night without asking, turned it over twice, and said nothing. 3 days later, it reappeared on my nightstand, ticking. She'd had it repaired by a jeweler 2 blocks from the tower, quietly, and left a note beside it. He'd want it to keep going. So do I. I cried in a way I hadn't let myself since the funeral, and Sable sat with me through all of it, not fixing, just present, her hand warm over mine, until my breath found its floor again. In return, she told me about the last thing her mother said to her, collapsed on a gala floor with half the board watching and doing nothing. Don't let them see you break, Sable. Not once. Not ever. And how she'd obeyed that instruction so completely for 14 years that she'd forgotten it was possible to be seen at all until a fired accountant walked into her hallway, smelling like amber sugar and old paper, and refused to look away. I don't want a contract wife anymore, she said low, against my hair. I want the real thing. I want to ask you properly, when this is finished, when my cousin isn't a threat hanging over both our heads. I want that too, I said, and I meant it with the whole unguarded weight of my chest. We had exactly 4 peaceful days before the ceiling came down. Desmond moved first. He leaked the guest room photographs to 3 financial papers with a headline already written for him. Castellan CEO's marriage a sham, sources say, timed precisely to a shareholder call where he stood up, tie perfectly straight, and moved to remove Sable as acting head pending review of irregularities in her personal and financial conduct. He didn't stop there. He'd found Brightwater Care Home's billing office and quietly bought the debt holding company that served it, and within the hour my mother's facility received notice that her account, the one I thought was finally clear, was being called due in full within 5 days under a new collections timeline. I found out about my mother's notice standing in the Castellan lobby with reporters already gathered outside the glass, shouting questions with my name in them, and I found out about the boardroom vote from Rue, who came down personally, face gray, to walk me through a side exit before the cameras caught the accountant at the center of the scandal. She's in an emergency session, Rue said. She told them nothing about you is fake. They didn't believe her. I went back to the residence that night and did the thing I swore I'd never do again. I made a list of everything I stood to lose, and at the top of it, higher even than the money, was Sable's face at the terrace door telling me to ask with my words when I was ready. Sable came home past midnight, and the woman who walked through the door wasn't the one who'd fixed my father's watch. Her jaw was set in the old boardroom line, the mask I hadn't seen in weeks slammed fully back into place. I need this handled quietly, she said, not quite looking at me. The board wants distance from the personal narrative until the vote settles. I can't be photographed with you until this clears. It was strategy. I understood strategy. It still landed like a slap I hadn't seen coming, an echo of a boardroom 4 weeks ago, and a glass of champagne I still hadn't fully washed out of my memory. So I disappear, I said. Same as I did the day they fired me. That's not what I said. It's what it sounds like. I was already pulling my duffel bag from the closet, the same one Miss Odell had carried in on the first night, hands shaking harder than they had in the boardroom, because this time there was something real to lose. My mother's facility is calling in a debt your cousin manufactured to buy in 5 days. I have 4. I need to go handle that before I have nothing left to fight with. Sable didn't stop me at the door. I told myself later that was the worst image of the whole story. Worse than the champagne, worse than the note in my clutch. Her standing in that vast cold foyer, saying nothing, while I walked out carrying everything I owned in one bag for the second time in a month. I spent the darkest of the 4 days at Fig Alameda's cramped apartment. My old coworker and the only person from Castellan Holdings who'd texted me the day I got fired instead of pretending she hadn't seen it happen. "You look like a woman about to do something reckless," Fig said, watching me spread 40 pages of shipping manifests across her kitchen table. "I'm about to do something exact," I said. "There's a difference." I worked through the night and most of the next day, cross-referencing the Shell subsidiary against Port Authority logs, insurance claims, and a set of internal timestamps Desmond had never thought a fired junior auditor would think to request under her own name before anyone revoked her access. By the second evening, I had what I needed, a complete, unbroken chain from the falsified manifests through the Shell company, through a wire transfer log with Desmond's own encrypted signature on it, time-stamped 3 days before he'd stood up in that shareholder call and called his cousin's marriage a sham to distract from his own math. Sable found me there, at Fig's kitchen table, at 11 at night. Rue must have told her where to look. She stood in the doorway looking like she hadn't slept either, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. "I should have said it differently," Sable said finally. "I should have said, 'Give me 1 day to handle him quietly so I can come back to you without a war on my back.' I said none of that. I let you think I was choosing the company over you, and I have spent every hour since watching that mistake on a loop. I have something that ends his war," I said, sliding the folder across the table instead of answering the apology directly, because I needed her to see it before I let myself believe the rest. Every dollar. Every date. His own signature. She read it standing, the way she'd read my first report on the 19th floor a month and a lifetime ago, and when she looked up there were tears in her eyes that the papers had never once photographed. "You did this in 4 days. I do my best work when I'm furious," I said. She crossed the kitchen and took my face in both hands, careful, asking permission with the pause before she moved. "Tell me to stop," she said, "and I will. And I will still fight for you every hour after." "Don't stop," I said. Not this time. The kiss that followed had none of the storm's desperation in it. It was slower, surer, a promise instead of a question, and when we finally broke apart, she rested her forehead against mine and said the words plainly, the way she said everything true. "I love you, not the accountant who solved my crisis. You. I have loved you since ginger tea I didn't know how to make." "I love you too," I said, and something in my chest that had been circled in red ink my whole life, finally balanced. "But your cousin still has a boardroom full of people who believe him." "We fix that first. Then we finish this properly." The emergency shareholder meeting was moved up to the next morning at Sable's own insistence, the first time in 14 years anyone in that boardroom had seen her request the spotlight instead of avoiding it. I stood at the podium in the green dress Miss Odell had chosen for me weeks earlier, my father's repaired watch on my wrist, and I laid the entire chain of evidence across the same table where I'd once been fired for a hunch. 41 falsified manifests, a shell company under a dead man's name, a wire signature that matched, stroke for stroke, the one on Desmond Castellan's own employment contract. "You called this marriage a sham," I said, and my voice did not shake. Not once. to distract this room from a fraud you built over 11 months. I'd like the record to show the accountant you had fired for finding it just found the rest of it. The room that had watched me get soaked in champagne a month earlier sat in a silence you could have poured concrete into. Desmond didn't go quietly. He surged up out of his chair, face gone the color of old paper, and lunged for the folder like he could unmake the evidence by tearing it, and it was Sable who stepped between us, taking the shove meant for me across her own shoulder, steady as a wall. "Touch her again," Sable said, low enough that only the front rows heard it, "and I will make sure the only boardroom you ever sit in again has bars on the windows." Security had him out of the building within the hour. The board voted, unanimous, to strip him of every share the trust had ever granted him, per the exact fraud clause his own greed had triggered, and to formally reinstate Sable as acting head with full confidence, effective immediately. I found her afterward on the harbor terrace, the same one where the storm had first found us, and when I told her, quietly, that I didn't want to see Desmond utterly ruined, only stopped, only accountable, she looked at me for a long moment and then nodded, the mercy landing exactly where I'd asked it to. "You're the only person alive who's ever told me to stop and had me listen," she said. "That's because I only ever tell you to stop when it matters," I said. "The rest of the time, I'm asking you not to." She kissed me there in front of the whole harbor. No cameras banned this time, no strategy, nothing hidden, and somewhere behind us I heard Rue Ibarra mutter to Miss Odell that in 15 years she had never once seen Sabel Castellan wait for another human being the way she waited. That night, for my answer, before she asked her next question. "Marry me," Sabel said. Really, no trust clause, no deadline, no 31 days, just because I want to spend the rest of the ones I have left choosing you every single morning. "I already married you once for a contract," I said, laughing through something that was mostly tears. "Ask me again for real, and I'll say yes twice." She did. I did. A year later, I stood in the same harbor light in a dress miss. Odell had cried while fitting, and this time when Sable Castellan asked me, with her words, plainly, to let her claim me, I said yes before she'd finished the sentence. We married on a Sunday in autumn, with Fig as my witness and Rue standing so close to Miss Odell at the altar that I suspected, not for the first time, there was a second love story quietly finishing itself in the wings of my own. The bond took at midnight, in private, exactly the way Sable had promised it would from the very first night in the kitchen, nothing taken that hadn't been asked for first, every line crossed only because I'd drawn her there myself. Desmond Castellan pled guilty to 11 counts of fraud before the year was out, and will not see the outside of a courtroom's shadow for a long while yet. Brightwater's manufactured debt was reversed within a week of the board vote, and my mother, when she finally met the woman I'd married, took one look at Sable's face and told her, with the bluntness only a mother allows herself, that she'd known her daughter had found someone worth the fight the day the ginger tea started showing up correctly brewed. I still work the ledgers, though these days it's by choice instead of necessity, and Sable still runs an empire, though these days she comes home before the harbor loses its light more often than not. My father's watch sits on the mantle of a home that finally smells like someone lives in it. Amber sugar and old paper, wet slate and clove smoke twined together into something neither of us could have written into any contract. Some mornings I wake up before she does and just watch the light cross the room, gold over both our hands on the same pillow, and I think about the girl who got fired for being right and soaked in someone else's champagne, and I understand now what I couldn't then. Being invisible was never the truth of me. It was only the wait before someone finally, completely looked. The end. If this one found something in you, that's exactly why I keep telling stories like it. Being overlooked doesn't have to be the end of anyone's chapter. Sometimes it's just the part right before someone finally sees you whole. If Marlo and Sable's story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel so the next one finds you too. And I'd love to know, what part of this story hit you hardest? The boardroom that finally listened, or the ginger tea that started it all? Tell me in the comments. Until the next story, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you there.